Vypadněte, pronesla ta žena chladným, rezolutním hlasem, který v luxusním sále pražského hotelu Grand Ambiance okamžitě utal veškerý hluk. Katerina Sterlingová stood there, perfectly composed in her tailored black blazer, her eyes boring into the scruffy man in a faded flannel shirt who was kneeling on the parquet floor. She didn't care that he was holding a toolbox, nor that he had spent the last 12 hours installing the acoustic panels for her company's anniversary gala. To her, he was an eyesore, an intrusion into her meticulously ordered world. Paní ředitelko, jen dokončuji upevnění pódia, Tomáš Reynolds began, his voice gravelly and whirled. Paní ředitelko, jen dokončuji upevnění pódia, Tomáš Reynolds began, his voice gravelly and exhausted. He didn't look up, his calloused hands focusing on tightening a final bolt. He had a job to do, and more importantly, he had a 7-year-old son, Oliver, waiting at home, who depended entirely on this paycheck. Nezajímají mě vaše výmluvy, Katerina interrupted, her tone dropping a fraction, becoming even more lethal. She stepped forward, the sharp click of her Christian Louboutin heels echoing like a gavel. Podívejte se na sebe, jste špinaví, páchnete pilinami a levnou kávou. Hosté dorazí za necelou hodinu. Nechci, aby moji klienti viděli tohle. Tomáš's hand froze on the wrench. For a brief second, his jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the hotel staff and the event coordinators on him. They were watching the powerful CEO of Sterling Logistics, the Železná vdova, as the newspapers called her, systematically dismantle a common labourer. Slowly, Tomáš stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, picked up his heavy tool belt, and looked Katerina straight in the eye. A strange, unflinching calmness settled over his face. A look that didn't belong to a simple carpenter. Jak si přejete, paní Sterlingová? Tomáš said quietly. He turned and began walking away, his heavy boots thudding against the polished floor. Katerina didn't waste another second looking at him. She turned to her head of security. Roberte, dohlédni, aby ten člověk okamžitě opustil budovu. A strněte mu 10% z honoráře za to, že nedodržel časový harmonogram. She had an empire to run, a multi-million euro shipping contract to sign tonight, and a mountain of corporate rivals to crush. She was the most powerful woman in the logistics industry, a billionaire who commanded boardrooms with a single glance. But as Katerina walked toward the VIP lounge, her sharp facade began to fracture. The iron melted into a profound, suffocating helplessness, because she knew that inside her massive, lonely villa in Vyšehrad, all her wealth was completely useless. Her 6-year-old daughter, Klára, had not uttered a single word in exactly 3 years. The silence had begun on a rain-slicked afternoon on the D1 highway, a catastrophic crash that Katerina was supposed to be in, if a last-minute hostile takeover hadn't kept her chained to her desk. Her husband had died instantly. Klára had survived, trapped in the mangled steel for 2 hours before rescue teams could cut her free. Since that day, her vocal cords were perfect, but her mind was a fortress. The doctors called it psychogenic aphonia, profound selective mutism triggered by severe trauma. As the gala began to roar with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and live jazz, Katerina stood in the center of the ballroom, smiling tightly for the cameras. She didn't know that down in the dim, under-construction storage area beneath the grand staircase, her daughter had just slipped away from her nanny, and she certainly didn't know that the scruffy carpenter she had just humiliated was currently sitting on a wooden crate in that exact dark corridor, holding his head in his hands as the sirens from the street outside triggered a memory he had spent 3 years trying to bury. Suddenly, Tomáš heard a sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a frantic, rhythmic tapping, accompanied by a soft, panicked wheezing. He clicked on his heavy flashlight, sweeping the beam across the shadows under the stairs. Tucked into the furthest corner, huddled behind a stack of unused acoustic panels, was a little girl in an expensive velvet dress. She was trembling violently, her hands pressed tightly over her ears, suffocating in a full-blown panic attack from the sensory overload of the gala above. Tomáš froze. His old instincts, long buried beneath layers of sawdust and grief, suddenly screamed to life. He didn't see a rich woman's child. He saw a soul drowning in hell. He dropped his tools. He slowly sank to his knees, making himself smaller, and began to speak in a low, rhythmic, gravelly cadence. A cadence he hadn't used in 3 years, not since his time as an elite paramedic. "Ahoy, malý ptačku," Tomáš whispered softly. The little girl's eyes snapped open. The flashlight beam stayed focused on the floor between them, a deliberate move to avoid blinding her. Tomáš kept his distance, his massive frame hunched to minimize the threat. He knew the little bird he'd addressed was currently caught in a sensory storm. The thrum of the jazz band through the ceiling and the staccato clinking of glasses were likely sounding like mortar fire to her ears. "Ahoy, malý ptačku," he repeated, his voice grounding and steady, cutting through the muffled roar of the gala. "It's okay. The noise is up there. Down here it's just the wood and the dust." The girl, Katerina's daughter, didn't move her hands from her ears, but her pupils, dilated with terror, locked onto his. Her velvet dress was stained with drywall dust, a stark contrast to the pristine image her mother projected upstairs. She began to rock, a rhythmic, frantic motion that spoke of a mind trying to outrun its own chemical surge. Tomáš didn't reach for her. He knew better. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unfinished block of cedar he'd been sanding earlier. He set it on the concrete floor and slid it toward her. "Smell that?" he asked softly. "It's cedar. It's real. It's not a ghost." The girl's gaze flickered to the wood. Her wheezing slowed just a fraction. Tomáš felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a ghost of its own. 3 years ago, he'd used this same tone to talk a teenager through a steering column impalement. He'd failed that boy. The memory flared, hot and bitter, but he shoved it back into the dark. Upstairs, a sudden burst of applause erupted, vibrating through the grand staircase. The girl let out a choked, silent sob, a heartbreaking sight. Her mouth opened, her throat worked, but no sound came out. Selective mutism. The rumors about Katerina's perfect silent doll suddenly made sense to him. This wasn't a choice, it was a cage. "I know," Tomáš whispered, his eyes softening. "The world is too loud. People are too loud, but they can't get in here." He began to hum. Not a song from the gala, but a low, vibrating drone in his chest. It was a frequency designed to soothe, a trick from his days in the field. Slowly, tentatively, the girl lowered one hand. She reached out, her small fingers trembling, and touched the cedar block. The silence between them was thick, but for the first time, it wasn't heavy. Then, the heavy fire door at the end of the corridor groaned open. "Elara! Elara!" The voice was sharp, frantic, and unmistakably Katerina's. The spell was instantly shattered. The girl recoiled, her back hitting the acoustic panels with a thud. her hands snapping back over her ears. Tomáš stood up quickly, his shadow looming large against the wall just as Katerina von Kessler rounded the corner, her silk gown shimmering in the dim utility light. She stopped dead, her eyes darting from the scruffy carpenter she had just insulted to her dust-covered daughter, cowering in the shadows. "What are you doing?" Katerina's voice was a whip crack, vibrating with a cocktail of terror and redirected rage. "Step away from her! What have you done to her?" Tomáš didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Katerina. He kept his eyes on Alara, who was disappearing back into her fortress. "She was having a panic attack, Mrs. von Kessler," Tomáš said, his voice returning to its rough defensive edge. "The noise from your party was crushing her." "I didn't ask for a diagnosis from the help," Katerina hissed, rushing forward to scoop Alara up. The girl went rigid in her mother's arms, her eyes fixed on Tomáš with a desperate, unspoken plea. Katerina pulled back, looking at her daughter's face, then at the cedar block on the floor. She looked at Tomáš, her expression a mask of frozen pride, though her hands were shaking. "If you ever approach my daughter again," she whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't quite hide, "I will have you off this site and blacklisted before the sun rises. Do you understand?" Tomáš picked up his flashlight, the light catching the sharp lines of his face. "She's not a doll, Katerina. You can't just polish her and expect her to shine. She's drowning, and you're the one holding the lead." The slap was loud in the narrow corridor. Tomáš's head snapped to the side. He didn't move, he just tasted the copper of blood in his mouth and watched as Katerina, clutching her silent child to her chest, turned and fled back toward the light and the jazz, leaving him alone in the dark with the smell of cedar and the ghosts of his past. The silence that descended upon the corridor after Katerina's retreat was heavier than the dust hanging in the air. Tomáš remained motionless, the sting on his cheek settling into a dull, throbbing ache. He spat a streak of crimson onto the unfinished floorboards and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes tracking the faint, lingering scent of expensive perfume, jasmine and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. He didn't resent the blow. He pitied it. It was the frantic, reflexive strike of a woman who had realized that her meticulously constructed world was fraying at the edges, and she had no thread left to mend it. But it was the look in Alara's eyes that kept him pinned to the spot. It hadn't been fear of him. It had been the hollow, ancient resignation of someone who had long ago stopped expecting anyone to listen. Tomáš knelt, his knees popping in the quiet, and retrieved the small, smooth block of cedar he had carved for her. The wood was warm, vibrating faintly with the distant thumping bass of the ballroom music seeping through the walls. He ran his thumb over the grain. It was a simple thing, meant to be a sensory anchor for a girl living in a house of glass, but it felt like a talisman of a war he hadn't realized he was joining. He stood up, his movements stiff, and clicked off his flashlight. The darkness surged back in, absolute and suffocating. He needed to get out of the main house. The gala, the champagne, the hollow laughter, the suffocating opulence, felt like a pressure cooker he wasn't equipped to endure for another hour. He made his way to the service exit, moving with the practiced ease of a man who knew the shadows better than the light. As he stepped out into the cool, biting night air of the estate grounds, the transition was jarring. Above, the stars were cold needles pricking through the velvet canopy of the sky. The sprawling gardens, usually a source of pride for the von Kesslers, looked like a graveyard of topiaries in the moonlight. He headed toward the detached carriage house where he'd been quartered for the duration of the renovation. As he walked, the image of Katerina's face, Not the mask of the socialite, but the raw, trembling terror underneath, played on a loop in his mind. She was terrified of her daughter's fragility, not because she loved her, but because Alara was the only chink in the armor of the von Kessler dynasty. If Alara broke, the legacy broke. Tomáš reached the carriage house and shoved the heavy door open. It smelled of sawdust and old stone, a grounding contrast to the artificiality of the mansion. He walked over to his workbench, tossing the cedar block onto a pile of blueprints. He pulled a crate over and sat, staring at the blueprints for the ballroom's expansion. His hands were still trembling, not from the slap, but from the adrenaline. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a worn photograph, tucked into a leather pouch, a woman with laughter lines around her eyes, standing in a garden much like this one, years ago. "She's not a doll, Katerina," he whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy. He looked at the blueprints, then at his hands. He was a carpenter. He built things that lasted, things that could hold weight. But looking at the schematics for the von Kessler home, he saw only trapdoors and gilded cages. He wouldn't be able to finish this job and walk away as if he hadn't seen the cracks in the foundation. He leaned back, the shadows of the rafters dancing over his face. Tomorrow, he would have to face the foreman. He would have to face the fallout of his outburst. But as he watched the moonlight trace the edge of the cedar block on his table, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just here to renovate a room. He was here to see if he could keep a girl from disappearing entirely. The dawn light filtered through the carriage house windows in dusty, sharp-angled shafts, illuminating the fine haze of cedar dust that had settled over Tomáš during his sleepless vigil. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night tracing the blueprints, not for the aesthetic curves of the crown moulding, but for the structural vulnerabilities of the East Wing. He stood up, his joints popping with the protest of a man twice his age. He splashed his face with tepid water from a basin, the cold shock doing little to dampen the anxiety coiled in his gut. Today was the reckoning. Foreman Marek didn't tolerate artistic temperaments, and he certainly didn't tolerate workers who laid hands on the help or tongues to the nobility. The foreman's shadow. Tomáš found Marek in the grand foyer, shouting orders at a pair of terrified apprentices who were attempting to haul a massive marble slab toward the new ballroom. Marek turned, his face a map of broken veins and irritation. "You," Marek barked, pointing a thick finger at Tomáš. "My office. Now." The office was a temporary shack erected in the courtyard, smelling of stale coffee and damp paper. Marek slammed the door behind them, the vibration rattling the window pane. "I had the head of housekeeping in my ear at sunrise, Tomáš. She says you caused a scene in the rose garden. She says you spoke out of turn to Lady Katerina." Marek leaned over his desk, his shadows swallowing the light. "I don't care how good you are with a chisel. You're a hired hand. You're here to fix the rot in the wood, not the rot in the family." "The girl was choking, Marek," Tomáš said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Katerina was going to let her suffocate for the sake of a silk dress." "And that is their business," Marek roared. "The von Kesslers pay for our silence as much as our craftsmanship. If Katerina wants to let the girl turn blue, you watch and you wait for the funeral so you can build the coffin. Do you understand me?" Tomáš felt a flare of heat behind his eyes. He thought of the photograph in his leather pouch. "I won't apologize for keeping her alive." Marek sighed, the anger deflating into a weary, cynical sort of pity. "I'm docking your pay for the week. Consider it a fine for your mouth. You stay in the East Wing. You don't speak to the staff. You don't look at the family. And for God's sake, stay away from the girl. One more slip, and you're back in the city gutters. The Gilded Cage. Tomáš spent the next 6 hours in a fugue of manual labour, sanding the floorboards of the ballroom expansion until his fingertips were raw. The physical exertion was a distraction, but his mind kept drifting to the floor plans. He had noticed something last night, a discrepancy between the original stonework and the 19th century additions. He was kneeling near the base of the grand staircase, checking the level of the joists, when a small, pale shadow fell over his hands. He froze. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of lavender and medicinal peppermint preceded her. "The wood is different here," Elara whispered. She was standing 3 feet away, dressed in a high-collared dress of stiff grey wool, looking more like a ghost than a child of 10. Her throat was bruised, angry yellow-purple marks where the collar had pressed. "It's oak," Tomáš replied without looking up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The rest is pine. Oak is for the parts that have to carry the weight." "Is that why it's darker?" she asked, stepping closer. "It's denser, harder to break." Tomáš finally looked up, his eyes softening despite Marek's warning. "How are you feeling, Elara?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a section of the wall where the new drywall met the old masonry. "There's a draft there. At night, it sounds like someone is breathing inside the walls." Tomáš frowned, standing up and dusting his knees. He walked to the spot she indicated. He pressed his palm against the stone. It wasn't just a draft. It was a rhythmic pulse of air, a sign of a hidden void. "That's the old servants' passage," he realized, his voice low. "It was supposed to be sealed during the 1902 renovation." "My mother says it's just the house settling," Elara said, her voice trembling. "But I think the house is hungry. I think it's waiting for me to stop breathing again." Before Tomáš could respond, the sharp click of heels echoed from the gallery above. Elara vanished instantly, slipping behind a heavy velvet curtain with a practiced, terrifying silence. Tomáš turned back to the wall, his tools forgotten. The cracks in the foundation weren't just metaphorical. The von Kesslers weren't just building a legacy, they were literally burying the past behind fresh plaster, and Elara was the only one who could hear it screaming. He reached into his pocket and felt the cedar block he'd smoothed the night before. He hadn't just carved a bird, he'd carved a key. Now, he just had to find the lock. The click of the heels stopped directly above Tomáš. He didn't look up. Instead, he picked up his rasp and began working on a piece of pine with a feverish, manufactured focus. The rhythm of the tool against wood filled the silence that Elara had left behind, but it couldn't drown out the pulse he had felt behind the masonry. "You're working late, Tomáš." The voice was cool, brittle, and belonged to Countess von Kessler. She stood at the railing of the gallery, her silhouette sharp against the dim chandelier light. She looked down at him not as a craftsman, but as a necessary intrusion. "The joints in the east wing need to be set before the humidity shifts, Countess," Tomáš replied, keeping his tone professional and subservient. "The wood remembers the rain." "The wood should do what it is told," she said, her eyes tracking the line where the new drywall met the old stone, the exact spot Elara had pointed out moments ago. "I heard voices. Was my daughter down here again?" Tomáš felt the weight of the cedar bird in his pocket. It felt like a hot coal against his thigh. "I haven't seen her since the morning meal, madame. It might have been the wind in the service passage. It's quite vocal tonight." The Countess's hand tightened on the marble balustrade. For a fleeting second, the mask of aristocratic indifference slipped, revealing a jagged edge of pure, cold fear. That passage was sealed decades ago. If there is a draft, find it and plug it. I want no more talk of breathing walls." She turned and departed, her heels striking the floor like a hammer on nails. Tomáš waited until the sound faded completely before he moved. He didn't return to the oak frame. Instead, he moved back to the wall Elara had signaled. He didn't use his heavy tools. Using the slim blade of a finishing knife, he began to scrape away the fresh plaster at the seam. The von Kesslers were obsessed with the surface, with the pristine, white facade of their legacy. But beneath the layers of paint and lath, the house was a carcass of secrets. As the plaster crumbled, a narrow gap appeared. The air that rushed out smelled of ancient dust, cedar oil, and something metallic, cloying and sharp, like old blood or rusted iron. Tomáš reached into the dark void. His fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It wasn't a stone. It was a mechanism. He pulled, and a section of the masonry groaned, pivoting inward on hidden, well-oiled hinges. This wasn't a forgotten ruin. It was a maintained secret. The passage didn't lead down to the cellars, as the old blueprint suggested. It rose, a narrow stone staircase winding upward within the very thickness of the walls, paralleling the grand staircase but hidden from view. "Elara?" he whispered into the dark. No answer, only the rhythmic thump, thump of the house's mechanical heart. He stepped inside, the cedar bird still gripped in his hand. The passage was lined with small rectangular slits, peepholes hidden behind the eyes of portraits and the decorative moulding of the gallery. From here, one could watch the entire household without ever being seen. At the first landing, he found it. A small wooden box sat on a stone ledge. It was identical in craftsmanship to the work he was doing downstairs, but the wood was weathered, aged by decades. He pressed his thumb against the latch, and the lid popped open. Inside lay a collection of small, carved wooden figures. A horse, a soldier, a cradle, and a small, crude bird, much like the one in his pocket, but broken in half. Tomáš realized then that he wasn't the first carpenter the von Kesslers had employed to fix the house. He was simply the latest. And Elara wasn't the first child to hear the walls breathing. A floorboard creaked behind him. Tomáš spun around, his knife raised, but the passage was empty. Then, from the darkness above, a soft, melodic humming began. It was the same lullaby Elara's mother sang, but the pitch was wrong, distorted and thin. "The oak is for the weight," a voice whispered from the shadows above. It wasn't Elara. It sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once. "But the pine is for the fire." Tomáš took the first step up the hidden stairs, the key in his hand, feeling heavier with every inch he climbed toward the heart of the von Kessler legacy. The air in the hidden shaft grew thin and tasted of pulverized lime and ancient trapped heat. Tomáš ascended, his boots scraping against the uneven stone steps, a sound that felt dangerously loud against the backdrop of that distorted humming. The key, the cedar bird, seemed to vibrate in his palm, a sympathetic resonance with the thump-thump of the house's mechanical core. He reached the second landing, where the narrow passage widened into a cramped observation chamber. Here the peepholes were more frequent, offering a panoramic view of the master's study. Through a slit hidden behind a massive tapestried eagle, Tomáš saw Baron von Kessler. The man wasn't sleeping. He was standing at his desk, frantically feeding papers into a small brazier. His movements were jerky, mechanical, as if he were a puppet being pulled by invisible, fraying strings. "The pine is for the fire," Tomáš whispered, the voice from the darkness still echoing in his ears. He looked down at the box he still carried, the one filled with the broken carvings. The humming stopped abruptly. "You shouldn't have brought that up here," the voice returned. It was closer now, emanating from a cluster of brass pipes that ran vertically through the stone. "The wood remembers the shape of the tree, Tomáš. And this house remembers the shape of the forest." A pale figure flickered at the edge of his lantern's reach. It wasn't Alara. It was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing a waistcoat that belonged to a century long dead. His skin had the grainy texture of unpolished wood, and his eyes were nothing more than knotholes in a mask of sap-stained flesh. "Where is she?" Tomáš demanded, his voice cracking. He kept the knife leveled at the apparition. "Where is Alara?" The boy pointed upward, toward the attic, the crown of the von Kessler lungs. "She is being fitted. The Baron needs a new heart for the clockwork. The old one, my sister, has finally rotted through." A sudden, violent shudder rocked the walls. The mechanical thumping accelerated, turning into a frantic, metallic gallop. Below him, Tomáš heard the Baron let out a strangled cry as the study door slammed shut and the heavy oak bolts slid into place of their own accord. The house was locking itself down. The blueprints were a lie, Tomáš realized, looking at the brass pipes. They weren't for heating or plumbing. They were a nervous system. The masonry is just the skin. "Go on then, carpenter," the boy thing hissed, fading back into the shadows of the riser. "Add your cedar to the pyre, or use it to wedge the gears. But know that if the heart stops, the house falls, and we are all inside the ribs." Tomáš didn't wait for the ghost to vanish completely. He lunged for the next flight of stairs, the wood of the bird carving now so hot it blistered his thumb. He could hear Alara now, not humming but screaming his name, her voice muffled by the thick, resinous layers of the ceiling above. The stairs ended at a heavy door of reinforced pine, charred black and smelling of turpentine. There was no handle, only a small, bird-shaped indentation in the center of the wood. Tomáš looked at the cedar bird in his hand. He looked at the knife. Behind him, the hidden passage began to contract, the stone walls groaning as the house breathed in, holding its breath for the final transition. He jammed the cedar carving into the slot. The door didn't open. It began to bleed. The marrow of the machine. The liquid oozing from the pine door wasn't blood in the human sense. It was a viscous, copper-scented resin that bubbled where it met the cold air of the passage. It hissed against the cedar bird, welding the carving into the lock with a finality that made Tomáš's heart stammer. The door didn't swing open. It dissolved, the blackened wood softening into a fibrous membrane that tore down the center like a ripening fruit. Tomáš threw his shoulder against the breach, tumbling into the attic. The crown of the von Kessler estate was a nightmare of horological anatomy. Giant, verdigris-coated gears, some the size of millstones, ground against one another in a slow, rhythmic dance. The floorboards here were translucent, revealing the pulsing network of brass veins he had seen from the walls. Everything smelled of ozone, old sweat, and the cloying sweetness of rot. "Alara!" He saw her at the center of the room, suspended within a cage of silver filaments that descended from the highest rafters. She was upright, her feet dangling inches above a massive, horizontal brass gear. The silver wires weren't just holding her, they were threading into her, stitched through the sleeves of her dress and the skin of her wrists with surgical precision. Across from her stood the Baron. He looked diminished, his velvet coat hanging off a frame that seemed to be collapsing in on itself. He was hunched over a control pedestal, his fingers dancing across a series of ivory levers. "Precision, Carpenter," the Baron croaked, not looking up. "The house is rejecting the old pulse. It demands a fresh rhythm. You arrived just in time to witness the synchronization. Let her down, you madman!" Tomáš lunged forward, but the floor buckled. A row of floorboards tilted like piano keys, forcing him to scramble back to avoid being crushed by the rising edge of a massive, submerged piston. "You don't understand the architecture," the Baron spat, a frantic light in his eyes. "The boy told you, didn't he? The masonry is skin. But a body without a heart is a tomb. My daughter's heart, the first clockwork, it has finally rusted. The house is starving. If I do not graft Elara to the mainspring, the rafters will collapse, the cellar will swallow the foundations, and every soul in this valley will be crushed by the weight of the von Kessler legacy." Elara's eyes fluttered open. They were filmed over with a milky sheen, her voice a dry rasp. "Tomáš, the bird. It's not a key." Tomáš looked at his empty hand, then back at the door where the cedar carving was being digested by the house. The heat was unbearable now. The very air seemed to vibrate with the gallop he had heard below, the sound of a machine losing its timing. "The blueprints," Tomáš shouted over the roar of the gears. "The bypass. You built a failsafe in the 1880 revisions." The Baron froze. His hands trembled over the ivory levers. The bypass was a theory, a suicide pact. It disconnects the house from the soul. It makes the wood just wood again. We would all fall. "Then we fall," Tomáš roared. He spotted the primary spindle, the vertical shaft that connected the attic gears to the depths of the mansion. It was a pillar of blackened iron, spinning so fast it hummed. If he could jam it, even for a second, the tension in the silver wires would snap. Tomáš gripped his knife. It wasn't enough. He needed something denser, something with the weight of the house itself. He looked at the heavy cedar beams supporting the roof. They weren't just structural. They were tensioned with iron bolts. "Tomáš, no!" Elara screamed as he began to climb the trembling framework of the cage. The house let out a scream of its own, a high-pitched metallic shriek as a gear tooth sheared off, flying past Tomáš's head like a cannonball. The lockdown was failing. The lungs were overinflating. Below, in the study, the bolts began to snap. Above, the stars were visible through the widening cracks in the roof. Tomáš reached the main tension bolt of the central beam. He didn't use the knife to cut. He used the hilt as a hammer, striking the locking pin with a rhythmic, desperate force that mirrored the dying heart of the house. Thump, thump, thump. "Stop!" the Baron shrieked, drawing a flintlock pistol from his waistcoat. "You'll kill us all!" "We're already dead in here," Tomáš countered, delivering one final, shattering blow. The pin flew out. The massive cedar beam, freed from its tension, swung downward like a great clock's pendulum. It didn't hit the Baron. It swung straight into the teeth of the primary spindle. The sound was not a crash, but a groan that vibrated in the marrow of Tomáš's bones. The house buckled. The silver filaments holding Elara snapped under the sudden torque, sending her falling toward the brass gear. Tomáš leapt, catching her mid-air as the world began to tilt at a 45-degree angle. Behind them, The Baron wailed as the floor beneath his pedestal simply vanished into the dark maw of the lower floors. "I have you," Tomáš gasped, pulling Elara against his chest as they slid across the tilting floor toward the jagged hole where the door had been. The mechanical gallop had stopped. In its place was the terrifying sound of gravity finally reclaiming its due. The von Kessler lungs had exhaled their last breath, and now the ribs were breaking. The descent was not a fall, but a grinding, rhythmic disintegration. Every joist in the von Kessler estate acted as a tooth in a dying predator's mouth, snapping and splintering as the structural integrity of the house succumbed to the weight of its own ambition. Tomáš slammed into the doorframe of the study, his arm hooked around a splintered mahogany post, his other hand white-knuckled around Elara's waist. Below them, the Baron's scream had been swallowed by the cacophony of shearing metal. The pedestal, the silver filaments, and the grand desk were gone, plummeted into a black abyss where the basement's secondary clockworks were now devouring themselves. "The rafters!" Elara choked out, coughing against the thick, bitter dust of pulverized plaster and ancient grease. "Tomáš, the outer rafters are anchored to the stone foundation. They're the only things not moving." She was right. While the interior of the house was a shifting puzzle of gears and collapsing floors, the external shell, the skin of the beast, remained momentarily fixed to the mountain's crag. "Hold on to my neck," Tomáš commanded. He didn't wait for her to agree. He launched them across the gap, boots skidding on a floorboard that was rapidly becoming a wall. They scrambled upward, defying the new vertical orientation of the room. Above them, the great spindle, the heart of the Baron's mechanical madness, had been wrenched from its housing. It hung precariously by a single copper chain, swinging like a wrecking ball. Creak. The sound was deafening. The massive cedar beam Tomáš had displaced was jammed into the primary gears, acting as a skeletal wedge. It was the only thing preventing the entire upper floor from pancaking into the cellar. "We have to get to the balcony," Tomáš shouted over the roar of escaping steam. "The glass is reinforced, but the frame is lead. If we can reach it before the spindle drops—" A sudden, sharp crack echoed from below. The Baron hadn't fallen to his death, not yet. A pale, trembling hand gripped the edge of the jagged floorboards 10 feet below them. The Baron pulled himself up, his fine silk waistcoat shredded, his face a mask of soot and pure, unadulterated fury. He still held the flintlock. "You've broken it," the Baron hissed, his voice a rattling wheeze. "The great work, the sequence. You've murdered time itself." "Time doesn't belong to you, Kessler," Tomáš yelled back, shielding Elara as the Baron leveled the pistol. "Then it belongs to no one." The Baron pulled the trigger. The flash was blinding in the dim, dust-choked room, but the house, in its final throes, shifted. A floor joist buckled upward, catching the lead ball and sending a spray of splinters into the air. The recoil sent the Baron stumbling backward toward the void. He didn't scream this time. He simply stared at the empty space where his masterpiece used to be, his eyes reflecting the cold, indifferent stars visible through the shattered roof. With a final, sickening lurch, the floor beneath the Baron gave way entirely. He vanished into the dark, followed by the heavy thud of the great spindle finally snapping its chain. "Tomáš, look!" Elara pointed upward. The central beam was shearing. The pressure from the jammed gears was too much. The wood was screaming, the fibers weeping sap under the heat of the friction. When that beam snapped, the roof would come down, sealing them in a tomb of brass and cedar. Tomáš grabbed a discarded length of silver filament, the very wire that had bound Elara, and looped it around a fixed iron sconce near the balcony. "Jump!" They leaped together as the central beam exploded into 1,000 shards. The ceiling plummeted. The world became a roar of falling stone and crashing timber. They swung through the archway just as the study collapsed into a heap of wreckage. They hit the cold stone of the outer balcony, rolling until they slammed into the balustrade. Silence followed. A heavy, unnatural quiet that felt heavier than the noise. Tomáš sat up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back. The von Kessler Manor, once a marvel of engineering that mimicked the pulse of a living thing, was now a jagged silhouette against the moonlight. It was a hollow ribcage of stone, the lungs silent, the heart shattered in the basement. Elara leaned against his shoulder, her hands trembling as she wiped blood from a small cut on her temple. She looked at the ruins, then at the valley below, where the lights of the village flickered, oblivious to the end of the Baron's era. "It's over," she whispered. "The clock has stopped." Tomáš looked at his hands, calloused, stained with grease and oil, the hands of a man who had spent his life fixing things. For the first time, he felt the weight of something he couldn't repair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small brass gear he'd carried since the first chapter of this nightmare. He let it drop. It didn't tick. It simply fell into the snow, silent and still. "Not over," Tomáš said, looking toward the dark woods at the base of the mountain. "The Baron is gone, but the blueprints, the designs he sent to the capital, we aren't the only ones who knew what was being built here." In the distance, the low, rhythmic thrum of an approaching steam engine echoed through the pass. The Baron's patrons were coming to collect their investment. The rhythmic thrum grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to mock the silence of the fallen manor. It wasn't the erratic, organic pulse of the Baron's clockwork. It was the cold, disciplined cadence of military industrialism. Tomáš pulled Elara back from the edge of the balustrade, dragging her into the long shadow cast by a surviving buttress. Below them, the mountain pass was sliced by two parallel beams of harsh electric light. The patrons weren't arriving in a carriage. They were arriving in an ironclad rail crawler, a multi-legged behemoth that hissed steam into the freezing night air. "The blueprints," Elara breathed, her voice tight with a new kind of exhaustion. "You said he sent them. If they find the wreckage—" "They won't just be looking for the papers, Elara," Tomáš interrupted, his eyes fixed on the approaching machine. "They're coming for the proof of concept. They need to know the lungs actually breathed before the ribcage collapsed. They'll sift through every stone of that basement to find the core." He looked at the smouldering remains of the study. The brass gear he'd dropped was already buried under a dusting of fresh snow, a discarded relic of a simpler time. His mind, trained to see the world in levers and fulcrums, was already calculating their exit. The main road was a death trap. The forest at the base of the mountain was their only hope, but the descent was a sheer drop of jagged limestone and ice. The rail crawler ground to a halt at the edge of the manor's courtyard. A hatch hissed open, and figures in charcoal grey greatcoats spilled out like ants from a disturbed nest. They moved with a precision that made the Baron's madness look like art. These were men of the capital. Men who viewed the world as a resource to be harvested, not a puzzle to be solved. "We have to move," Tomáš whispered. "Now." They moved low and fast across the balcony, heading toward the western wing, where the servants' stairs might still be standing. Every step was a gamble. The floorboards groaned, weakened by the structural failure of the central beam. As they reached the blackened doorway of the gallery, a voice boomed through a brass resonator from the courtyard below. "By order of the Ministry of Armaments, this site is now a restricted zone. Any survivors are to identify themselves immediately or be treated as insurgents." Elara gripped Tomáš's arm, her fingers digging into his leather jacket. "Insurgents? We lived here. We were his tools," Tomáš corrected grimly. "And now we're witnesses. The ministry doesn't leave witnesses to failed investments." They reached the stairwell. It was a spiral of precarious stone, choked with dust but miraculously intact. As they descended, the sound of boots on the gravel outside became a deafening crunch. The soldiers were breaching the main hall. At the base of the stairs, Tomáš paused. A flicker of light caught his eye from the direction of the Baron's private workshop, a room they thought had been levelled. A single lamp was still burning, powered by a backup galvanic cell. "Wait here," Tomáš said. "Tomáš, we don't have time." He didn't listen. He slipped into the workshop, his boots crunching on glass. On the central workbench sat a lead-lined canister sealed with a familiar wax crest. It was the final shipment, addressed to the capital's chief engineer. Tomáš didn't take the canister. Instead, he grabbed a heavy wrench and smashed the seal, venting a hiss of pressurized gas. He pulled a handful of phosphorus matches from his belt and laid them in a trail leading toward the Baron's remaining chemical stores. "If they want the legacy," he muttered, "they can have the funeral pyre." He scrambled back to Elara just as the first flashlight beams cut through the gloom of the gallery above. They slipped out through the cellar vent, tumbling into the snow, just as a muffled thump echoed from within the manor. The workshop didn't explode, it began to melt. A low, intense violet flame licked out of the windows, fueled by the Baron's volatile breath compounds. The soldiers screamed orders, distracted by the sudden chemical fire. Tomáš and Elara didn't look back. They plunged into the tree line, the cold air stinging their lungs, the rhythmic thrum of the rail crawler fading behind them. They were no longer fixers or assistants. They were ghosts in a world that was rapidly turning to iron. The tree line offered a temporary sanctuary of pine needles and shadow, but the violet glow of the manor pulsed against the low-hanging clouds, a neon heartbeat marking their escape. Tomáš stumbled, his boots catching on a hidden root, and Elara caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite the tremors racking her frame. "Don't stop," she hissed, her breath a plume of silver in the moonlight. "The heat will draw the hounds. They'll know we didn't burn with the rest of it." Behind them, the manor groaned, a structural wail of cooling stone and twisting metal. The Baron's breath compounds were hungry, eating through the oak rafters and the lead-lined canisters alike. The air smelled of ozone and scorched sugar, a scent that Tomáš knew would haunt his senses until the day he died. They reached the crest of the ridge, where the Great Northern Line cut a jagged scar through the valley. Below, the rail crawler sat like a dormant beetle, its steam vents huffing rhythmic white clouds. The soldiers were disorganized, drawn to the spectacle of the violet pyre, but the chief engineer's personal guard remained stationed at the crawler's gangway, their rifles held across their chests. "We can't go back for the horses," Tomáš said, looking down at his blackened hands. The wrench had bitten into his palm, leaving a jagged welt. "We aren't going back for anything," Elara replied. She reached into her heavy wool coat and pulled out a crumpled set of schematics. Not the Baron's final shipment, but the rough drafts he'd discarded weeks ago. "The capital wants the finished product, but they don't have the catalyst. I took the stencils for the filtration unit while you were setting the fuse." Tomáš looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the smudge of soot on her cheek and the hard, cold light in her eyes. The ghosts they had become weren't just fleeing. They were carrying the only thing the Empire couldn't buy with blood, the knowledge of how to undo the Baron's work. A low, guttural rumble shook the earth. It wasn't the fire. It was the rail crawler's engines cycling up. The soldiers were abandoning the manor, retreating to the safety of the iron behemoth as the chemical fire began to spread to the surrounding timber. "If that crawler moves north, it reaches the border by dawn," Tomáš whispered. "And the chief engineer will report that the Baron died in an accident, taking his secrets with him." "Let him," Elara said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Let the world believe the fire consumed it all. We head south, toward the coast. There are others, scholars who fled before the iron took over." They began to walk, keeping to the shadows of the ridge, moving away from the warmth of the burning legacy. For years they had been cogs in a machine they didn't understand, serving a man who saw the world as a series of chemical equations. Now the variables had changed. As they rounded the bend of the mountain, the manor finally collapsed. A column of violet sparks erupted into the sky, a final defiant salute to the man who had tried to bottle the wind. The sound was a dull thud, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the winter forest. Tomáš didn't look back. He felt the weight of the matches in his pocket, and the warmth of Elara's hand as she reached out to steady him once more. The world was turning to iron, cold and unyielding, but they were the carbon in the forge, the impurity that made the steel break. They disappeared into the white expanse of the valley, two silhouettes against the snow, leaving the age of the Baron to burn itself out in the dark.